In this video, we'll be looking at one of the most heartbreaking cave tragedies in modern history. The story of a cave that was permanently sealed while a human being was still inside. And yes, this is the story of what happened at Nutty Putty Cave. Just outside Salt Lake City, Utah, on the morning of November 24, 2009, a group of friends and family members gathered at the entrance of Nutty Putty Cave for what was supposed to be a fun Thanksgiving week adventure. Among them was 26-year-old John Jones, a medical student who had explored this cave several times during his childhood. John was excited to share this experience with his brother Josh and a group of 9 people. He had fond memories of squeezing through the cave's narrow passages, and on this particular day, he was eagerly looking forward to introducing his brother to a section he called the birth canal, an incredibly tight passage popular among experienced cavers. Nutty Putty Cave was discovered in 1960 and quickly became a favorite among Utah's caving communities. The cave got its name from the brown, putty-like clay that covered portions of its interior. At approximately 1,400 feet long and 400 feet deep, this cave wasn't particularly expansive compared to other cave systems, but what made it unique were its incredibly narrow passages. Some sections were so tight that even experienced cavers could barely squeeze through. Despite these narrow spaces, or perhaps because of them, the cave attracted thousands of visitors each year. Families brought their children. Scout troops organized exploration trips. However, Nutty Putty had a darker side as well. The cave had been temporarily closed in 2006 after numerous rescue incidents, including one where a group of Boy Scouts got stuck in a particularly narrow section. After improved safety measures were implemented and new regulations were put in place, the cave reopened in 2009. When John Jones arrived that morning, there was a sense that Nutty Putty was safer than ever. The group entered the cave shortly after 8 p.m. on November 24th. John was leading the way, navigating through familiar sections with the confidence of someone who had done this before. The cave was cold, caves typically are, maintaining a constant temperature of approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the season. As they descended deeper, they passed through the big slide, crawled through narrow tunnels, and eventually reached an area where the group decided to temporarily split up to explore different sections. Eager to find the birth canal and relive old memories, John initially moved forward with just his brother Josh following him. However, at one point John proceeded on his own, squeezing through increasingly narrowing passages. That's when he made a critical mistake. In the labyrinthine passages of Nutty Putty, John thought he had found the entrance to the birth canal. What he actually found was a passage that would come to be called Bob's Push, an unmapped, significantly more dangerous tunnel. The entrance to Bob's Push was angled roughly 70 degrees downward. It was narrow, but John had been through narrow spaces before. He pushed himself headfirst into the opening, using his arms to pull himself forward and pushing his feet against the walls behind him to advance. As he descended deeper, the passage became even narrower. Then it narrowed even more. At one point, John realized this wasn't the birth canal. This was something entirely different, and he needed to go back. But that's when things became horrifying. John couldn't move backward. The angle of the tunnel, combined with how tightly his body was wedged inside, made it physically impossible for him to generate enough leverage to push himself upward. His arms were pressed against his chest. His legs were extended at an awkward angle behind him. And worst of all, he was completely upside down, with his head approximately 10 inches lower than his feet. John called out for help, and his brother Josh quickly responded. When Josh found him, he could only see John's feet and lower legs protruding from the narrow opening. Josh tried to pull him out, but John was stuck tight. The brothers initially remained calm, believing that with enough effort and perhaps some help from the others, they could get John out relatively quickly. However, as minutes turned into hours, the reality of the situation became increasingly grim. At 9:30 p.m., approximately 90 minutes after John entered Bob's Push, emergency services were contacted. The Utah County Sheriff's Office immediately understood the severity of the situation and mobilized the local cave rescue team. What followed was one of the most complex and desperate rescue operations in American caving history. The first rescuers reached the cave around 11:30 p.m. Experienced cave rescue specialists squeezed through the narrow passages to reach John's location. When they finally got to him, they found a frightened but still conscious and clear-thinking young man. He told them about his wife Emily and his 13-month-old daughter. He talked about working to become a doctor. He remained hopeful that they would get him out. However, the rescuers immediately understood how dire John's situation was. He was stuck in a passage that was 10 inches wide at its narrowest point and 18 inches at its widest. He was positioned upside down at a 70 to 80 degree angle in a nearly vertical shaft. And perhaps most critically, his body was bent in such a way that blood was pooling in his head and chest. So what does this mean? What happens to a human body if it stays upside down for a long time? Being upside down for an extended period is extremely dangerous for the human body. The heart has to work twice as hard to pump blood, and pressure builds up in the brain and lungs. The rescue team tried everything they could think of. They attempted to use a rope and pulley system to pull John out by his legs. At one point, they managed to move him up a few inches, a moment of hope that was quickly destroyed when the pulley system failed, and John slid back into an even worse position. They tried lubricating the passage walls. They tried different angles and different techniques. Nothing worked. As the hours stretched on, John's condition began to deteriorate. Medical personnel on site were communicating with John through the narrow passage and were growing increasingly concerned about his vital signs. Breathing was difficult. His heart rate had increased, and every minute he remained upside down was causing more damage to his internal organs. The rescuers worked in shifts because the conditions inside the cave were extremely challenging. The passages were so narrow that rescuers could barely move. The temperature, while constant, was cold enough to create hypothermia after prolonged exposure. And the emotional burden of working so close to John, hearing his voice, knowing that time was running out, was overwhelming. In the early hours of November 25th, approximately 28 hours after John became stuck, the medical team delivered devastating news. John's heart had stopped. The rescuers performed CPR as best they could in the impossibly confined space, but ultimately there was nothing more they could do. John Jones was pronounced dead while still trapped inside Bob's Push. The decision about what to do next was agonizing. Recovering John's body would require widening the passage, which could take days or even weeks, and could put additional rescuers at significant risk. After consultation with John's family and cave rescue experts, an incredibly difficult decision was made: to leave John's body where it was and permanently seal the cave. Over the following weeks, teams worked to collapse strategic sections of Nutty Putty Cave, ensuring that no one would ever enter it again. John's final resting place was sealed with concrete. A memorial plaque was placed at the cave's entrance, honoring his memory and serving as a reminder of the risks inherent in cave exploration. The tragedy of John Jones serves as a harsh reminder that even familiar places can harbor unexpected dangers. John wasn't reckless. He wasn't inexperienced. He simply made a wrong turn in a complex underground environment where the margin for error was extremely thin. What was supposed to be a fun outing with family turned into one of the most haunting rescue attempts in caving history. Nutty Putty Cave remains sealed to this day, a limestone tomb and permanent memorial to a young man who loved adventure but whose life was tragically cut short in the darkness beneath the hills of Utah. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to write it in the comments.